The sword that waited, the planet was silent. Its skies were dark with heavy clouds, and the land was nothing but broken stone and deep cracks that stretched for miles. In the center of this wasteland stood a sword. It was not a normal weapon. The blade was bright with blue fire, and it hummed softly as if it was alive. The sword had been there for longer than anyone could remember, standing in the ground like a monument waiting for someone to claim it. Generations of aliens had come to this place. Strong warriors with bodies covered in scales, massive giants with arms like tree trunks, creatures with wings and claws sharper than steel. All of them had tried. They had surrounded the glowing sword with their chants, with their weapons raised high, believing they were the chosen ones. But when they placed their hands on the hilt, the sword rejected them. The blade would not move. Not even an inch. The legend spread across the galaxy. They said the one who pulled the sword free would rule not only this planet, but would command respect across the stars. Some believed the weapon had been forged by ancient gods, a relic of a forgotten war. Others whispered that it was cursed, a trap to test the pride of those who thought themselves powerful. But all of them agreed on one thing: the sword waited. It waited for someone worthy. Centuries passed, and still the sword remained where it was. The ground around it was scorched, the rocks blackened from the endless attempts. Bones of those who failed lay hidden beneath the dirt. The place had become more than a battlefield. It was a shrine, a grave, and a warning. Still, the aliens kept coming. They came with hope, and they left in shame. On this day, the crowd was larger than ever. A gathering of species from across the system had come to watch the latest challenger. The air was filled with noise. Voices speaking in a dozen strange tongues, laughter, anger, bets made between rival clans. They stood in a circle, waiting for the moment the next warrior would step forward. But this time was different. The challenger was not an alien of great size or terrible strength. He was human, a lone traveler from a small world, unknown to most who stood there. His body was not as large as the reptilian beasts beside him, nor did he have the claws of the insect-like creatures in the crowd. He was just a man in worn clothing, carrying nothing but a pack on his back. The aliens laughed when they saw him walk forward. Some pointed, mocking him. Others shouted, their voices filled with anger that such a weak creature would dare approach the sword. One alien with skin like iron stepped close and hissed at him, warning him to turn back. But the human did not stop. He looked at the glowing blade, and his eyes did not show fear. He had heard the stories. He knew that no one had ever succeeded. Yet something inside him told him he must try. It was not greed or hunger for power that brought him here. It was curiosity. It was the same spirit that had pushed his kind to leave their small planet, to travel among the stars. The sword had waited for so long, and he wanted to know why. He stepped into the circle. The air grew colder. The crowd grew silent. The sword's light grew brighter, as if it had sensed something new. The human stopped just a few steps away from it. He stared at the weapon, and for a moment it felt like the blade was staring back at him. He knelt on the ground, touching the earth around the weapon. The rocks were warm, humming with energy. His hand moved closer to the hilt, but he did not grab it yet. He wanted to feel it first. His fingers hovered above the metal, and he could feel the power buzzing like electricity in the air. The crowd leaned forward. No one spoke. They had seen hundreds of attempts. They expected the same ending. The human would try, the sword would not move, and he would leave broken and ashamed. But something felt different this time. The silence was heavy, and the light from the sword flickered like a heartbeat. The human took a deep breath. His hand closed around the hilt. It was colder than ice, and yet it burned against his skin. A sharp shock raced through his arm, almost forcing him to let go. But he held on. He had faced storms and hunger and fear before. This was no different. He tightened his grip. The ground rumbled softly. A low vibration moved through the stones, through the circle of onlookers. The aliens exchanged nervous looks. Some stepped back. They had never seen the sword react like this. For the first time in countless years, the weapon was alive. The human's heart pounded in his chest. Sweat ran down his face, and the blue light wrapped around his hand like living fire. The sword was heavy, heavier than anything he had ever touched, but he did not release it. He closed his eyes, pushing against the weight, feeling the power resist him. He pulled once, and the blade remained. He pulled again, and the stone beneath it cracked. The crowd gasped. Dust rose into the air. The sword was not free, but it had moved. For the first time in history, the sword had answered. The aliens stared in silence. The human still knelt with his hand on the weapon, breathing hard, refusing to let go. He did not know if he could lift it. He did not know if he was worthy. But he knew one thing. The sword had waited, and now it had finally stirred. The ancient weapon had chosen to test him, and he was ready to fight for it. The struggle against destiny. The human remained on one knee, his hand still gripping the hilt of the glowing sword. His body shook with exhaustion, sweat pouring down his face, but he refused to let go. Around him the air shimmered with blue fire, the light burning against the darkness of the ruined valley. The crowd of aliens stood frozen in silence, none daring to move closer. For the first time in centuries, the sword was no longer resting quietly in the stone. The ground still trembled from the effort. Cracks spread outward like veins across the battlefield, and dust rose in the air, glowing as the light from the blade pulsed. Every breath the human took felt heavy, as if the weapon was pressing down on his chest, crushing his lungs, testing if he had the will to continue. He could have let go. He could have released the sword and walked away alive, but something deeper held him in place. It was not greed or the promise of power. It was not even pride. It was something older, buried in the heart of every human. It was the refusal to surrender. The sword seemed to sense this. It pushed harder. Its energy wrapped around his arm like chains, digging into his skin with invisible weight. The humans of Earth had always fought against chains, against limits, against the idea that something was impossible. And now, here in a place far from home, he was proving it again. His vision blurred, but his mind burned with memories. He remembered nights as a child staring at the stars, wondering what worlds were out there. He remembered the struggle of his people, the endless storms and hunger they had faced, the way they built homes from nothing and survived against odds that should have broken them. Each memory gave him strength. Each memory became another reason not to let go. The aliens watched with unease. The great scaled warriors who had once mocked him now stood silent, their eyes wide. The insect-like beings with sharp limbs clicked nervously, shifting their stance. Even the massive giant with stone-colored skin lowered his head, as if unsure if he was witnessing something holy or dangerous. The human pushed again. The sword rose another inch, its light flaring so bright it burned the eyes of those watching. A sound filled the air, not from his throat, not from the crowd, but from the sword itself. It was a deep hum, a voice without words echoing across the valley. It was as if the weapon was speaking, but only the human could hear it. The voice was not gentle. It was sharp, commanding, filled with weight. It asked questions without language, questions that struck into his very soul. Why do you hold me? Why do you fight for me? Why do you not let go? The human had no words to answer. His reply was in his action, in the way he refused to release his grip. His body might break, his bones might shatter, but he would not surrender. That was his answer. The sword's light shifted. The glow turned darker for a moment, as if the blade was angry. The ground shook harder, a deep quake running through the valley. Rocks cracked, some splitting into fragments. The aliens stumbled, their voices rising in panic. A few fled, convinced the end of the world was near. Still, the human held on. His hand bled now, the skin torn from the strain. His arms burned as if fire spread through his veins. He pulled again, his muscles screaming. His teeth clenched so tight that blood filled his mouth. The blade rose higher. The sky cracked open above him, lightning striking across the clouds. The valley filled with thunder that echoed like war drums. The aliens fell to the ground in fear, covering their heads. None of them had ever seen the planet itself respond to a challenger. But the sword did not yield fully. It resisted, twisting against his grip, trying to force itself back into the earth. The human felt his body falter. His strength was fading. His vision grew dim. He knew if he let go now, the sword would sink back and never rise again, and no one else would ever have another chance. He thought of Earth again. He thought of every small struggle, every soldier who had stood when they were outnumbered, every worker who had endured when hunger pressed against their ribs, every child who had dreamed when the world told them not to. He thought of all of them, and he carried their spirit in his chest. The human screamed with all the breath left in his lungs. His voice cut through the storm, raw and desperate. A cry that carried not only his struggle, but the struggle of his entire species. His body shook as he pulled again, and for the first time the sword loosened. The stone cracked wide open, releasing a blast of light that threw dust into the sky. The blade was almost free, but just before it broke loose, the energy exploded outward, hurling the human back. He slammed into the ground, his chest heaving, his body nearly broken. The sword fell silent, glowing softly again, halfway risen but still locked in stone. The alien stared at him. None spoke. None moved. They had seen what no one else in history had managed. The sword had almost been claimed. The human lay on the ground, his breath shallow, his body shaking. His hand still reached out toward the weapon, refusing to crawl away even in defeat. He could not stand. He could barely breathe. But inside him, something refused to end. The sword had tested him. He had struggled against destiny itself, and though the blade had not yet surrendered, it had revealed a truth to all who watched. The human was not like the others. He had come closer than anyone. The fight was not finished. The sword had not given up on him, and he had no intention of walking away. The awakening of the sword, the battlefield was still. The dust slowly settled, drifting down like pale smoke across the broken stones. The human lay on the ground, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. His arms trembled as he tried to move, his body weak and beaten from the struggle. Yet even now his hand reached out toward the glowing sword. He had been thrown back, but his spirit refused to let go. The aliens stood in silence around the circle. Their eyes shifted between the sword and the human, their disbelief growing heavier by the second. No one spoke. They had seen warriors far greater than this human try and fail without the sword ever reacting. Yet now the blade was halfway free from the stone, glowing brighter than ever, its light running across the cracks in the earth like rivers of fire. The ground gave a low rumble, not from the human's effort this time, but from the weapon itself. The sword pulsed with light, each beat stronger than the last. It was as if the weapon was alive, as if it was waking after a long sleep. The air thickened with energy, a heavy pressure that made the aliens step back. Their bodies shook under its weight. Even the strongest among them bent their knees, unable to stand tall against the force that poured from the sword. The human pulled himself to his knees, his vision blurred, his skin covered in dust and blood. He stared at the weapon, and for the first time he understood. The sword was not an object. It was not a prize. It was something greater. It was waiting not for strength, but for someone who would endure, someone who would not break even when crushed. He forced his legs to move, crawling back toward the weapon. His body screamed for rest, but his will drove him forward. The aliens gasped, some whispering that he was mad, others whispering that perhaps he truly was chosen. As his hand touched the hilt again, the ground split wide. The valley shook violently, sending rocks tumbling and cracks racing across the battlefield. The sword's light exploded outward in a sudden burst, painting the night sky with fire. The clouds above tore open, lightning flashing down in furious strikes. The very sky seemed to bow to the awakening of the weapon. The aliens cried out in fear. Some fell to their knees, covering their faces. Others tried to flee but found themselves frozen in place, held by the sheer force pressing against their bodies. None could move closer. None could challenge what was happening. The human gripped the hilt once more. The energy seared through him, hotter and heavier than before, but he no longer resisted it. Instead, he welcomed it. He let the power flood his body. Let it test him, let it burn him from within. His heart raced, his vision sharpened, and for a moment he felt as if he was no longer just himself. He was every struggle his kind had ever faced. He was every voice that had ever refused to surrender. The sword responded. Slowly, it rose higher from the stone. The sound was thunder, the sky roaring with it, shaking the valley down to its core. The light blinded the crowd, wrapping around the human like living fire. His body stood tall now, no longer on his knees. He pulled with both hands, his face set with unshakable resolve. The stone cracked wide beneath him, breaking apart as if it could no longer hold what it had trapped for so long. The sword rose again inch by inch until at last it broke free in a blinding flash. The moment was deafening. Light burst outward in every direction, racing across the valley, into the mountains, into the sky. The aliens were thrown to the ground, their cries swallowed by the storm. The human stood in the center of it all, the glowing blade raised in his hands. The sword had awakened. Its fire flowed around him, wrapping his body in shimmering blue armor of light. His wounds sealed, his strength returned, his eyes burning with the same glow as the blade. The human felt the weapon's heartbeat inside his chest, and he knew then, it had not chosen him because of his strength. It had chosen him because he would never stop fighting. The aliens slowly rose from the ground, staring in awe. Their voices were whispers at first, disbelief hanging heavy in the air. Then came silence again, the kind that weighed like stone. Not one dared to challenge him now. The weapon had made its choice, and its choice was clear. The human lowered the sword, the energy still glowing, humming softly like the voice of a living thing. He looked around at the crowd, at the faces of every species that had failed before him. They stared back, some with fear, some with wonder, but none with doubt. The weapon that had denied all others now belonged to him. Yet even in that moment of triumph, the human knew the test was not over. The sword had awakened, but its purpose was still hidden. Its glow spoke of battles yet to come, of enemies yet unseen, of a destiny greater than he could imagine. The aliens began to kneel, one by one, until the whole circle bowed low before him. They had mocked him, called him weak, but now they lowered themselves in respect or in fear. It no longer mattered. The truth was plain to all of them. On a world where no alien could lift the ancient sword, the human had done the impossible. But the true story was only beginning. The legend of humanity. The sword's glow dimmed to a steady blue flame, no longer blinding but still alive with power. It hummed softly in the human's hands, its light flowing like water down the blade. The battlefield was silent, broken only by the crackling energy that surrounded the weapon. The aliens who had gathered stood frozen, their faces pale with disbelief. They had spent centuries trying to claim the sword, offering their strongest, their proudest, their most ruthless champions. Yet all of them had failed. Now a human, small, fragile compared to them, stood holding the weapon they could not move. The human lifted the blade slowly. The weight was immense, but it no longer felt like resistance. It felt like partnership, as though the weapon had tested him and now allowed him to carry it. Blue light wrapped around his body, healing wounds, steadying his breath. He stood taller than before, his figure sharp and commanding in the glow of the awakened sword. No one dared laugh now. No one mocked. The crowd of alien warriors who had once sneered and jeered now bowed their heads. Some knelt on one knee, pressing their fists to the ground in respect. Others lowered themselves fully, their faces pressed into the dust. Even the proud scaled beasts who had roared in anger now bent their necks before the human. The human said nothing. He did not smile or boast. His eyes stayed on the blade, knowing what it meant. The weapon had chosen him, but not for glory, not for power. It had chosen him because he dared to try when all others had given up. A deep voice echoed across the valley. It was not a voice of flesh and blood, but of the sword itself. The sound rumbled through the ground, through the air, through every being present. None understood the words fully, but the meaning reached their hearts. The blade declared its wielder. It announced the human as the one it had waited for. The crowd trembled. Fear turned to awe. Awe turned to silence. Every alien there understood they were witnessing the birth of a legend. The human lowered the blade until its tip touched the cracked stone. The blue light sank into the earth, spreading in veins of fire across the battlefield. The ground healed beneath his feet, the cracks closing, the dust settling. What had been a place of failure and shame for countless generations became something else. A place of hope. A place of legend. Slowly, the human looked up. His eyes glowed faintly with the sword's power. He scanned the faces of the alien tribes. There was no anger in his gaze, no cruelty. Only calm. He had not come for domination. He had not come to prove he was better. He had come because he refused to turn away from a challenge. And that was enough. The aliens understood. They rose slowly from their kneeling positions, their eyes fixed on him. No one dared challenge him now. They knew the sword would not answer to them, not anymore. It had chosen. And it had chosen a human. Whispers began to spread through the crowd. Words carried from one alien to another, until they grew into a chant. At first it was soft, hesitant, but then it grew louder, carried by voices in a dozen languages. It was not his name they spoke. Many did not even know it, but the word that now defined him. Human. The sound echoed across the valley, filling the air with something greater than fear, greater than anger. It was respect. It was recognition. The human lifted the sword again, holding it high above his head. The light flared once more, touching the clouds above, casting a glow that could be seen for miles. The valley, the mountains, even the skies themselves seemed to bow to that moment. For the first time in history, the ancient weapon had found a master. For the first time in history, it had chosen not strength, not blood, not pride, but will. The legend of that night would spread. Aliens who had mocked would return to their homes and speak of the human who dared. They would tell stories of the sword that no one could lift until one fragile being tried and refused to stop. They would remember how the planet itself shook, how the sky split with light, and how the impossible became real. And across the stars, that story would grow. It would be told in whispers in alien courts, sung in low voices in dark taverns, carved into stone by tribes who believed they had witnessed something divine. The tale would echo through generations. The sword that had rejected all had finally been claimed. By a human. The human lowered the weapon, its glow now steady, no longer wild. He knew the test was over, but his journey was not. The sword had awakened for a reason. Its power was not meant to stay buried. Somewhere out there, across the galaxy, battles awaited. Enemies greater than any yet known waited in the dark. But when that time came, he would be ready. The sword had waited for him. Now together, they would face whatever destiny demanded. The crowd of aliens parted as he stepped forward, their heads bowed as he walked past them, the sword glowing faintly at his side. Not one stopped him. Not one dared. They only watched in silence as the legend walked out of the valley, carrying the weapon that had refused them all, and from that day on, one truth remained. On an alien planet, no being could lift the sword, but the human dared, and the human succeeded.